Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're going to talk about compliance risk in the commodities markets. Those risks are only going up as regulators become more powerful and have greater reach, and digitisation creates more data for them to analyse. And it's not just about being legally compliant. With increasing focus on ESG, investors, stakeholders, and employees are holding companies more and more accountable for their actions. Being non-compliant can be an existential threat both for businesses and individuals. Businesses face market capitalization collapses, liquidity issues, withdrawal of investors, but individuals too. At worst, can be put in jail. At best, might be named and have their careers ruined forever. Joining us to discuss compliance is Frank Hayden. Frank is Vice President of Compliance at Calpine, the US utility, and also chairs the Energy Trading Compliance Discussion Group, which has over 60 companies participating. Frank's also on the CFTC's Market Risk Advisory Committee, and for compliance sake, I should say that all views expressed herein are Frank's own. Frank, thanks for joining.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
Before we dig into some of the detailed sources of compliance and the consequences of not being compliant, can you just put some definitions around what we mean by compliance in this sector?
Okay, so compliance in this sector refers to following the rules of engagement. And there are lots of different regulators involved with the energy in the United States. You have the CFTC, you have FERC, you have state regulators, you have market monitors with the various ISOs and RTOs. And so at the first step, it's really understanding those rules and how to make sure that you don't go sideways or cross the line, if you will. The second step to it is really understanding your standards and abiding by them. I think when you set out and you kind of look at how you build your organization and how you put together a brand, if you will, there's a certain amount of core values and standards that you kind of set out internally within your group. And so obviously compliance is following those standards as well. So on one hand, you have the legal framework, and on the other hand, you have your own internal expectation on what it means to align to the goals and values of your company. So I think that's kind of where compliance sits right now.
Yeah, and the consequences of being non-compliant are huge, both obviously from the legal framework standpoint, but also actually for organizations themselves having individuals or selection of individuals not following the policies as well.
Yeah, let's jump into that real quick. There's huge downside personally to non-compliance. I mean, everything from going to jail, for an example, destroying your reputation could be another one. So from that level, it's the first and the last thing you think about when you run a business. You're very keenly aware that the reputation, that your name, that your credentials are at risk. And I think that one of the key things to kind of understand from an organization point of view is the market capitalization question. I think that when you get involved with activity that's shady and you have a reputational problem, your market cap can suffer pretty materially, and that has impacts on funding, has impacts on capital, has impacts on how you manage your business and manage your trades that you have going on, right? So I think that's a key aspect as well to really think about when you focus on this legal thing. And it starts out fairly tight. In other words, you really worry about your own ecosystem. But as you expand globally, there's more complexity that gets layered in. And as you expand globally, you start addressing or having different compliance pinch points that you really need to think about. and those require you to really go back to your core values and how you make those decisions.
Yeah, so you've got, on the one hand, as an individual, you've got these, the risk of being named at the very least, which can effectively end your career. If you become Googleable, basically, all the way through to obviously jail, and that has happened. And for the entity themselves, you've got certainly the impacts on market capitalization, access to funding, and these incredible fines as well. I mean, the scale are enormous. $900 million. A recent one. So the downside is significant, and as you mentioned there as well, this is also being overlaid with increasing complexity because of the commodities world is global. You've got multiple jurisdictions. One thing you said to me, which I think was a really poignant point, it was you're also this is somewhat asymmetric warfare, in that if you get in the sights as an individual of a regulator, there's very little. They have very deep pockets.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's a money problem, right? I mean, for sure, the regulator has infinite capital, and they can pursue you to drain your bank account pretty easily. And often, you try to come back with a surrender, and you say, "Hey, okay, I'll cough up and confess." And the number you're thinking you're looking at, it's the number they come back to you at is 2x of what you're originally thinking. So I think that for sure it's a very drawn out process, and what kind of makes it, what's interesting here, is that the whole world is digitizing, right? And data is becoming more and more fungible, and is becoming more and more common. And the net is getting pretty well put together on understanding how the pieces interact. Well, with that comes more and more questions. And, it's not unheard of for the regulator to come out and ask you a question about the data. Well, that interaction is not an easy interaction to have because, particularly here in the United States, you have a duty of candor. You have a responsibility to tell the whole story and to explain it clearly and succinctly. And it's tough enough to explain to the chef that you're at, what restaurant you're at, well, how you like your steak. It's more difficult to explain it to a regulator what a particular trade is or what your intention really was. And so that creates a gotcha moment in the fact that if the regulator feels like you've been misrepresenting the facts or the fact pattern, they there's a law against that, right? So the penalties increase, they don't decrease, and so it's a very awkward. It's a it's an awkward conversation, and for sure, as the data analytics improves, there's more and more people asking questions about, well, what was this, or what, could you explain this to me? And that presents a compliance moment or compliance problem, if you will.
Adding to that, I guess, that complexity. So that's the legal framework. I just very quickly want to touch, and I know this gets into business ethics and business cultures, but there is formulated its own compliance or framework for behaviors and actions, which presumably is going to typically be quite far ahead of where the baseline of the legal framework stands. Actually, it's important for organizations as well to be aware of individuals are breaching that particular code as well. Why is that?
Your company recruits a certain type of person for a certain reason, right? And that reason being, hey, this is our brand. This is how we we present ourselves in the market. And non-compliance with that has impacts to the company brand, and we're seeing this a lot in the ESG side right now. We're seeing that that if you're not adhering to the social aspect or the governance aspect of that brand, then in fact it impacts capital, it impacts funding, it impacts your ability to transact, if you will, in the market. And so I think that, yes, the legal ramifications are huge. I do think, though, that the upside from being compliant, the upside from having well articulated core values, the upside to adhering to those value system actually adds value to the enterprise. Um, and it doesn't just add value from the outside looking in. There's also an uplift internally with regards to operational efficiency. Because if, let's just take a typical trade floor that has errors inputting deals, right? If you can, you know, encourage a compliant environment where these errors can be eliminated, then in fact you have greater operational efficiency, which brings in other capabilities.
From a talent attraction standpoint, being able to reassure current and future employees that your systems are going to protect them from potential compliance issues, given the personal downsides, is also huge as well.
Yeah, I mean, the moniker that you use in compliance is basically three letters. It's PDR, right? It's prevent, detect, and remediate. And so if you're able to kind of manage the prevention side, and for sure the front office employee isn't wearing that risk because he feels it's adequately being prevented from occurring. And so there's a little bit of a relaxation on how much that risk cost him when he sizes up the opportunity for himself, right?
I think we've got a good feeling of the intensity of how serious an issue this is. This is when work can truly impact your personal life in a very, very negative way. And as you alluded to, so where are the sources, or what's driving people and even businesses to not be compliant? Can you sort of pick apart that for us a little bit?
Well, I think it's the thought that I need to make money. There was a survey, I believe it was E&Y back in 2016. There was a fraud survey, and in that survey, 42% of the participants said they could justify unethical behavior to meet a financial target. Okay, and so that's pretty shocking when you think about just the human nature aspect of it, that the pressure to make money, well, the feeling is, well, I have to cut corners. I have to behave in a non-compliant manner to make an extra buck. And I think that's not correct, right? I mean, from my point of view, I think that's a fallacy that, gee, I have to behave in this way to kind of make money. I do think that the more veteran you are in the business, the more you realize that less is more. Like, you don't need to explain a lie to get someone to transact or to make a profit, right? You just have to present the bid and the offer and say, and assuming they're willing to transact at the bid or at the offer, you can still get your business done, right?
So it's incentives. So, I mean, I guess to sort of take that conversation a bit broader, you typically in the trading world, you've got people whose compensation is directly linked to the performance, the profit, the P&L that they drive, and certainly their future prospects are attached to that. So you've got a huge incentive to both make money and get rewarded, but also not be, put it colloquially, fired for non-performance. But in some senses, I guess what you're saying is probably also a miscalculation of risk, because whilst perhaps the chances are relatively slim, although we're about to come on to arguing that those chances are increasing exponentially of being caught, given the data now available and sort of forecasting and analysis and so forth, that you're unlikely to get caught. But frankly, the downsides of getting caught, as people will attest to, are infinitesimally worse than losing your job. So in some ways, it's a bit of a miscalculation of incentives, but it definitely comes down to, I think, as you say, there's lots of incentives, and human nature will be driven by that to perhaps act in this way. But it also seems to be, and this is, I think, this is a little dated because of recent trends, but also businesses themselves have in the past positioned themselves on, if a compliance spectrum, because that's a competitive advantage for them, whether that means that they were doing business in locations, countries with countries that perhaps had different lower compliance standards or whatever it might be, that enabled them to compete differently to, say, an organization that has stakeholders who would forbid such behavior and so on. So there's the individual level. Can you talk to that business level a little bit?
Yeah, so on that point, yeah, I think if you would roll back the clock, to 1990s, early 2000s, and whatever, I think there's a lot of thought about how where can I gain an advantage, and some of that advantage, we've seen it through labor laws, right? We've seen people say, well, gee, I can hire some people in another country to assemble my garments, for an example. And they kind of skirt the particular issue that they're dealing with in country. um, and I think that the mistake there is, if you ask them their core values, they would not they wouldn't come up with that answer, right? They would say, no, I think that our core values is, our brand is built this way, and people perceive us as responsible, ethical business practices. If they found out that we were in fact exporting, our product abroad to kind of be made by, slave labor, if you will, they would play out very poorly for us. I think that that is becoming a harder sell point. There are folks out there that their kids are asking them, hey, why are how are you behaving ethically with carbon, for an example. I think that the trend we're seeing is a trend toward digitization and a trend toward data. And what it really means is that everything becomes discoverable. Okay. And so the idea that you can kind of gain a competitive advantage by, doing a regulatory arb, uh, it doesn't play out that well, especially with the ESG framework that's out there, right? So I think that's one of the important trends we're seeing. I mean, we're not just seeing a trend toward data analysis and review of behaviors. We're also seeing a trend from the credit rating agencies to evaluate a company holistically, and that holistic view is an environmental view, it's a social view, and it's a governance view. And I think that that sort of competitive advantage is no longer a competitive advantage. It becomes more of a liability, in the sense that the data is coming together. Like, I think you and I, Paul, were talking, a little while back about, in 1990, there wasn't a lot of memorandums of understandings between the different agencies. There was not a lot of data analysis being done. And so, in theory, the net was pretty loose. And you might have been able to do some stuff that you probably couldn't do today. Now, I think if you throw that same behavior today, and let's assume it's ethical behavior, let's assume it's not it's not bad behavior, it's good behavior. Well, even with good behavior, you're going to get a lot of questions asked. And I think the question being asked, it's important to be able to answer it, honestly, holistically, and promptly. Uh, and I don't think that the half answer is going to make the regulator go away. I think that you need to be able to provide a complete answer to those sorts of questions.
Yeah, and there's a trail to it as well, right? I mean, one of the other things that we're seeing is, yeah, actions that happened a decade ago is still being investigated. The statute of limitations, if there are some, are still quite long, and everything remains discoverable because it sits in digital formats. I want to just one other source before we move on to, I guess, what's meant to be the guts of this, which is about actually managing compliance and some of the new technologies that are coming in that really take it from kind of a backward-looking process to a forward-looking process. I just want to very quickly touch on, there is also kind of being non-compliant inadvertently, right? And some of that's because the regulations frequently change, especially here in the United States. There can be a lack of understanding within the administration itself or the regulators about, the actual industry. Some of these, power markets are incredibly complex. And there's a lack of case law as well around some of these regulations that can also mean that it's not always black and white what is compliant and what isn't from a legal framework. And I guess that's somewhat down to the judgment call of the compliance officer. But that is also a factor as well.
Yes, you're right. The regulations are easy to understand, and they can be very unclear at times. And we often look to case law to really understand how to interpret them, right? And so I think and as you push out from a local view to a more global view, the complexity only increases. And one of the things, an interesting thing to kind of recognize in this space is that there's no such thing as double jeopardy. You can be hit up by every single agency out there, and you can be pursued. So you don't necessarily, just because you resolve an issue with the exchanges doesn't mean that you don't have an issue with the CFTC. Just because you solve an issue with the CFTC doesn't mean you don't have an issue with the Department of Justice. And so that elevates the importance of the whole situation. And so training is critical, right? I mean, making sure that they are aware, that they kind of think about these issues up front. Like, a lot of commercial folks don't necessarily think that, gee, buying a expensive bottle of wine at an outing could in fact create a problem, a compliance problem. Um, so I think that it's important that you consider the whole gamut. And with the training, your core values of your company become absolutely important. And because they will cover off where there's no rules and there's no regulations, right? So if your core value is, let's say, for an example, ethical behavior, well, that's culturally defined, right? That the having that as a core value, well, it sounds great, but depending on what culture you're talking to, there's different uh, practice with regards to what that is, right? And so I don't necessarily recommend a lofty, high level core value. I recommend something more measurable.
So moving on, you've got big downsides, big upsides. How has trying to manage compliance changed over the last decade or so? Because I think there's been some rapid changes in how organizations have gone about thinking about compliance.
Companies recognize the risk, right? And they struggle with how do we address the risk. And so I think step one is to get away from the reactive mindset into a proactive mindset, right? So I think that's step one. And with that proactive mindset, you're kind of recognizing that compliance encompasses my reputation. So what is reputation? Reputation is the granddaddy bucket that holds your credit risk, your market risk, your operational risk, your legal risk, and your compliance risk, right? It all sits there underneath reputation. And with reputation brings in your access to the markets, your access to funding, et cetera, right? So I think that the first step is really to recognize it. I can own this. I can do something about this. I can be proactive, right? So let's first, before we go to the proactive, let's look at what the reactive model is. The reactive model is you basically run some reports You basically check boxes, and basically you wait for the regulator to call. And then when the regulator calls, you run the gamut and get the data, and you produce the evidence, and you discuss, and you write a check, and the problem's gone. Now, in the early 90s, uh, the Department of Justice kind of understood this was a problem. And so they put together the idea that, hey, if you do certain things, you can actually get your fine reduced. Okay, now it's been well refined since then to where we are today. But if there's certain things that you're doing, you can mitigate some of the tail risk with respect to the fine. So that becomes the first thing as you cross over from a reactive mode to a proactive mode, and that hinges on this idea of what they call an effective compliance program. So you can have a lot of great ideas, and if they're not tangible, being done type of boots on the ground type of work, they'll still say that you're not an effective compliance program. And literally, if you go through these fines that are out there, you can read these cases where they had great processes and they were not effective. Like Enron's an obvious example, right? Enron's ethics book was well written, well thought of. Outside law firms put it together, pretty comprehensive. But in the end, it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, right? Because no one listened to it, no one followed it, right? So so I think that, as you move from a reactive model to a proactive model, then you start saying, okay, I want to be on top of my business. I want to run reports. I want to kind of look at the data. Well, you start realizing that the data has a lot of variation to it. There's structured data that comes out of your trading systems. There's unstructured data that's found in your communications, in your phone calls, and there's a need to figure out how to pull this together and understand it, right? So one of the big steps you make as you go from a reactive model to a proactive model is you start realizing that you're unable to control the number of exceptions you identify. Okay, so if you go back looking back to the proactive model, you get a sample of some exceptions. You make sure that the population is, consistent, homogeneous population. You identify a confidence level you want to have. You sample that population. You clear that sample, and the entire population is healthy at that point, right? So sample of 1,000, you review your 50, and you didn't find any problems in the 50, and so all 1,000 are good, right? Well, you can manage that sort of workflow because you can control statistically, how you sample, right? When you switch over to the data analytics world, you really have no control over the number of exceptions you find. And I think one of the most telling stories about this is that, when FERC publishes their year-end review of enforcement, they highlight how many exceptions they identify. And I think, like in power last year, they had over 300,000 exceptions. Then they go on to explain how many were actually referred to, and cases where charges were filed, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, you get an avalanche of data coming at you every day. And so this brings in the need to start figuring out a way to process this and understand it, which tends to, so if you look at the life cycle of this, okay, you bring the data in, you say, oh, gee, I want to look for this. And let's say you want to look for, we could pick a behavior. Let's say you want to look for spoofing, okay? And you say, well, I want to define a spoof as uh, a buy and a cancel on a pair of trades. Now the question is, well, what's your time limit? 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 2 seconds? What are you looking at, right? And then that kind of ties into, well, what's the liquidity of the market? How liquid is the market here? Maybe in fact my spoofing parameter for illiquid market needs to be 5 minutes long, and maybe my spoofing parameter for highly liquid market only needs to be 2 seconds apart, right? So it really depends on how you look at it, which again brings in more data analytics to it, right? And as you build it out, you try to understand what it is, and then you have to process it and score it and look at it. Now, flip over to communications. You have the same sort of problem there, right? You're using a lexicon to identify, particular communications that you think could be problematic, and now you have to figure out a way to review these and score these and understand, is there a particular issue for the company that you can help mitigate or remediate, if you will, right? For sure, prevent. But that becomes a part of the process as well. So as you look at this life cycle, the first step is acquiring the data. Second step is trying to figure out how to bring the data together consistently to be reviewed and looked at. And then the third step becomes, well, how do you process all this data? How do you stay on top of the workflow? Because the workflow can crush you and defeat this effort to become an effective compliance program, right?
So if I can, you know, paraphrase, so the reactive is what we've always had, right? Someone raises an issue and it gets investigated post fact. Um, the problem, as you move to more of a forecasting or preventing issues before they become so significant they can destroy reputations or take down the company, you're using data analytics. And all things data analytics, the issue isn't getting the data. That's easy. The issue is designing what questions you're going to ask of it and making sure those questions are giving you something valuable. Because in the broad course of human history, human behavior during the day, you're going to get someone sends an email that whatever, but has a certain lexicon in it that triggers a response, but you don't want to shut down working operations if that just is a normal blip or part of just of an anomaly. So it's asking questions of it, and I guess this is essentially organizations wanting to sort of prevent things at source and take advantage of this data analytics. Is how widespread? I mean, is what organizations are doing, or is this only for the very large organizations? Kind of, what's your sort of sense of where the industry is at as a whole when it comes to applying the best of data analytics and forecasting to compliance challenges?
Well, I think it's a very nascent area. For sure, large financial institutions are grappling with this problem, right? I mean, a lot of companies are trying to figure out, how do I get better at this? I mean, the oil drilling companies, they look at it as well from a FCPA perspective. So I think there's a whole converging going on. Like, how do I address compliance in an increasingly complex world? I'm aware of a particular company that what they do is they use the GPS off your phone, and depending on what regime you're in, or where you are, what country you're in, they'll send you a text message. They'll say, "Hey, these are the rules of engagement. This is the particular compliance regs you need to worry about," right? There's other companies that will go through and they'll take a look at your calendar invite and see who you're having meetings with, and they'll run it against a prohibited name list, a OFAC list, to kind of understand if in fact this is someone they should be meeting with, right? Uh, so I think that the key is a lot of companies are grappling with this right now, and no one really has the answer.
I guess looking forwards, this seems like an issue, and I agree entirely that we've also kind of moved from the CSR world to the ESG world, which is much more measurable, much more precise, much more, I think, impactful on business operations. But we're going to this. We look forwards. You've got increasing prevalence of data and availability and democratization of data. You've got obviously better tools to kind of forecast and predict behaviors, but you've also got increasing globalization, increasing power of regulators, who've been infinitely empowered compared to 20 years ago. the ESG piece is bringing in NGOs and external standards that organizations need to be compliant with. It seems like this is going to get big and big quickly, for organizations as we go into this next decade. Can you just give us your 2 cents on kind of the future of compliance?
I think what we'll see as we proceed here is, active shareholders, NGOs, access to capital markets. I think they will start looking at the holistic pieces of the ESG framework and try to really understand the governance, the social aspects of it, as well as the environmental piece. From a doer perspective, I think data analytics is here to stay. We see today memorandums of understanding between the different regulatory authorities where information is being shared, where 10 years ago you didn't have that. You didn't have that information being shared. Now you do. And you're seeing them put together a fabric, a quilt, if you will, of the different data pieces. And I think from a doer perspective, you know, mimicking that internally, understanding that. So let's say, for an example, you actually put this all together and you feel like you have the same data analytics suite the regulator has. Well, the one piece of information you have that the regulator doesn't have access to is the communications that go on around it, what the intent is, how it's really understood. And so I think a big piece to be worked on is understanding how to mine that out. Now you are seeing that in some hedge fund activity where they're looking at Twitter feeds and are trying to understand market sentiment versus to predict price directions, right? I think there's going to be a bleed over of that into this area, right? I think people are going to really try to understand, well, what does that really mean? If I could use natural language processing to really understand intent better, then in fact I could better understand the wrapper that all this data is nested inside of, right? And so I think that becomes a key thing. So to kind of answer the question, uh, for sure it's not going to go away, and for sure the trend we're seeing in the digitalization of the business is having deep is making deep inroads into the compliance area, and it's causing or creating a need to dashboard, measure, and report out, which with those measurable metrics change behavior internally so that companies become more compliant, right? And so I think that is a key thing. And I think that, one of the things I like to see happen in the business is I like to see the compliance functions start gearing more toward the traders as opposed to the compliance professionals. So let me explain what I mean there. So a lot of the compliance software out there in the market, it's really geared toward the compliance analyst, and it's really geared toward the compliance professional. It's not geared to the commercial area. And I think that if you could, in fact, gear this to the commercial area, I think you'll get some real changes in behavior. And the example I use when I talk to folks is, the school zone sign, right? Like when you're driving in a school zone, you have everything you need to know to control your speed. You have gas, you have brakes, you have a speedometer. Everything you need to know is there in front of you so you can control your speed. Yet, a sign flashing outside your car showing you the speed that you're traveling causes you to slow down, right? It causes you to not be driving fast. And I think that is critical. So I think that one of the things I see happening in this compliance area, especially with the use of mobile technology, is I see that feedback loop being presented to the commercial leads such that they're able to learn, much like, learning a car learns to drive, so they can learn that this is a trip hazard. This is a compliance moment. I need to really understand what this means right now, right? And so I think that is a big piece. And one of the ways to effectuate that is to adopt a risk approach to compliance. And that doesn't necessarily mean a risk like, gee, this has the largest fine, this is my largest risk. It basically involves taking an ecosystem viewpoint toward the compliance risk itself, right? So if you think about, let's say you're trading New York. New York has its own ecosystem, and there's a position that sits there. There's a weather that's unique to it, and there is a counterparty name attached to it, if you will. Now, similarly, the trader that traded that, he has his own ecosystem. His ecosystem could be his VAR for the day. It could be his credit limits for the day. It could be how many position violations he's had. His ecosystem is somewhat different than this positions ecosystem. And this could, in fact, overlap with another ecosystem, right? But the point is that there's several overlapping risk that concurrently could mean you have compliance problems, right? And so I think that's where it's going. If you ask me where's the trend taking us, I think the trend's taking us in that direction.
Frank, it's been a fascinating discussion. I think that it is an ongoing discussion about how organizations are going to manage what is only becoming an increasingly complex risk to their business as it globalizes and as there's more data available and there's more regulation out there. I really appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoy being a guest here on the HC Insider podcast.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. To find out more about HC Insider and Human Capital, a search firm dedicated to the commodities sector, go to www.hcinsider.global, where you'll find more original content on the commodities sector and more details on our offering as a search firm and our locations around the world. Thanks again for listening.